If I could just get my slide to work. Here it is. Here's the agenda for day one, which is today. So we will have the welcome and framing of GP support to COVID responses from Margarita Focuslicht, who is the manager of the partnerships team. That will be followed by an overview of the evaluation findings by the evaluation team, consisting of Learn More, Triple Line, and Technopolis. We'll then have two thematic sessions, the first of them focusing on distance learning, and the second one looking at supporting teachers. And that'll conclude day one, and then tomorrow we will have a second day where we will have two more thematic sessions, one on equity and inclusion, and reaching the most marginalized, and the second one on adaptive implementation. So just a few short logistical notes. There is interpretation throughout the event in English and French, and you can find the language options at the bottom of your screen. There's also a question and answer box where we definitely encourage you to write any questions you have throughout the sessions. Panelists are going to be able to answer those in writing, and we'll also allow verbal responses during the sessions where there's time. We are going to be recording the webinar today, and it will be available for sharing with colleagues in due course for anybody who can't make it today or can't stay the whole time. So without further ado, please let me welcome Margarita to the virtual stage to kick us off with some opening remarks.
Thank you, Anna. Let me welcome everyone to this webinar and just give you a few introductory remarks before things get started. In early 2020, as we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic plunged education systems worldwide into crisis. Children, parents, and teachers across the world were faced with mass school closures and with uncertainty over when schools could reopen and how to ensure that learning could continue. At its peak, the COVID-19 pandemic forced the closure of schools for 1.6 billion children. And during the first 2 years of the pandemic, 147 million children missed at least half of their in-person schooling, totaling 2 trillion hours of lost learning. This was a massive loss of hard-earned gains in education. And the immense challenges drove our partnership into action. GPE's board rapidly approved nearly $500 million in grant funding, making GPE the earliest and largest provider of funds dedicated to education in the global pandemic response. Within 2 weeks after WHO declared a global pandemic, GPE provided immediate support for contingency and response planning through a multi-country allocation of $8.8 million to 87 countries managed by UNICEF. GPE partner countries and partner organizations reacted promptly to minimize disruption to education systems globally. And as the pandemic continued, GPE supported 66 countries to provide education to children through the modalities best fit for their context. Supported activities included a range of tools for distance learning, training of teachers to adapt methods and track learning at a distance, socio-emotional support to children and teachers, preparation to ensure that schools could reopen safely, and remedial learning opportunities for children. So we all join efforts in some of the most challenging times, and as a partnership, we should take pride in our ability to step up in times of crisis. But now it's time to learn from what worked and what we could have done better. In 2023, GPE commissioned an independent summative evaluation of our support to partner countries during the COVID pandemic. The evaluation was conducted by the firms Learn More from Italy and Triple Line and Technopolis from the UK. Their study examined the level of success of GPE-supported programs, identified promising practices, and formulated lessons to improve responses in similar future events. While we appear to have returned to a new normal, there is no denying that the lingering effects of the COVID-19 pandemic remain. The disruption to education systems caused by the pandemic is without parallel, widening the gap between wealthier and poorer children across the globe. Some have dropped out permanently, while others still suffer from significant learning losses. This education disruption has had particularly devastating impacts on women and girls worldwide, threatening to reverse the progress made towards gender equality in recent decades. The mental health impact of the pandemic on children and young people is also of great concern. But the pandemic has also allowed us to discover and build on innovative ways of teaching and learning. We have accumulated a plethora of lessons and evidence. We've learned about what worked well when responding to the pandemic and what was not as effective or impactful. We now have a better understanding of alternative forms of education, and in particular, the use of technology to deliver education, even in the most challenging of circumstances. Looking ahead to the next potential crisis, it's imperative to take stock of what we have learned and put into practice in education planning, programming, and implementation. Let me end my opening remarks by calling attention to a couple of examples of innovation that stand out, though there are many more. With Save the Children Australia as grant agent, the GPE COVID-19 grant for the Kingdom of Tonga included the development of multimodal learning resources designed to be reusable. This reduced the time and upfront costs to develop new materials in response to future disasters. The resources have already been put to use following the eruption of the Tonga Ha'apai volcano and subsequent tsunamis in January 2022. Another example, improved remote learning materials also have the potential to address underlying access issues. And the COVID-19 grant to Côte d'Ivoire included the development of a digital learning platform with learning materials in video and braille form. This platform can also address systemic access issues in the longer term, and UNICEF was grant agent in this case. In conclusion, I thank you in advance to all our speakers and audience for joining the dialogue these next 2 days. And as Anna already indicated, we'll start today with a presentation from the evaluators outlining their overall findings, and we'll then delve into 2 thematic sessions using blended solution for learning and supporting teachers during the pandemic. And we hope you can also join us tomorrow when we continue with 2 more thematic sessions, the first on reaching the most marginalized and the second on adaptive implementation and resilience. The many lessons we've learned from the pandemic response have the potential to prepare education systems to be more resilient in the face of future crises. It's time to look back to think forward, and I'll hand back now to Anna Maria to introduce the evaluation team. Thank you.
Super, thank you so much. So Lorenzo, please, I invite you and your colleagues to take the stage and share your presentation.
Thank you very much, Margarita and Anna Maria. And thanks all of you for being here. Thanks to colleagues at GPE who were tremendous support during this evaluation, and to everyone else who participated. My name is Lorenzo Newman. I'm Managing Director of Learn More. I conducted this study with my colleague Lisa Ruzakova, who's also here, Jessica Chu from Triple Line, and Judah Javorka from Technopolis. The context in which GPE provided support to its partner countries was unprecedented. So what we're going to discuss today is really a large-scale experiment that had never been seen before. This is a fast-evolving situation with a lot of unknowns, with very little evidence from the outset as to what was going to work. The scope of this evaluation includes the planning grant, the AF grant, and the global grant. Building on a formative evaluation conducted almost 2 years ago, we evaluated the coherence, relevance, efficiency, and effectiveness and potential for impact of the grants across both the design of the grant facilities all the way through to the end of implementation. Emphasizing gender, we were able to achieve this through a portfolio analysis of data from all grants, as well as 10 country case studies, although data from the latter source was less available than we had hoped. A key finding is that generally the needs at the country level were met, although there's less evidence around whether relevance was maintained as the pandemic evolved. Key to this was the speedy rollout flexibility and streamlined screening process for the grants. And I should note that this was thanks to the use of a pre-existing facility with the AF grant. It's remarkable that grants were aligned to ERPs thanks to the planning grant, and were designed in consultation with LEGS, despite the high speed at which this was all occurring. The global grant guaranteed continuity of learning by igniting coordination, and was a remarkable success stories of different grant agents, the World Bank, UNESCO, and UNICEF working together. All three grants were flexible and adaptive, although it's not always clear whether countries took advantage of this. Only 6 countries requested scope changes, despite the fact that, as we know, pandemic circumstances were unpredictable. And in Bangladesh, this was due to changes in government, not due to changes in the pandemic. Conversely, Ethiopia, which had one of the longest pandemic school closures, over 400 days, revised the scope of its activities twice. That said, the grant designs generally contributed to addressing the needs of diverse vulnerable groups, although this was hard to measure further on. I should also note that the grant flexibility allowed countries to focus on a broad range of activities, which was highly appreciated. And a lot of these were around recovery, as you can see on the chart at the right. We'll see in just a moment what this meant in practice. Generally simpler and less ambitious activities were those more effective in reaching their targets, particularly around protection and well-being, and maintaining minimum hygiene standards in schools. Back to school campaigns were particularly successful. One success story is the use of songs in Cameroon. Coordination, strong procurement, and alignment with and between the grant agents was particularly key. And I should also note that grants with fewer objectives tended to do better in terms of reaching their targets. So once again, simplicity was key. The grants faced a lot of the familiar challenges around yielding learning outcomes. Although 77 million children were reached, teacher training was a key bottleneck, often due to the lack of digital skills. And technology was a bottleneck too, especially in low-income countries, where even low-tech facilities such as radio weren't always feasible, such as in DRC, where many countries did not have radios. Countries that did meet their targets, such as Cote d'Ivoire, sometimes did so inequitably, with urban students 3 times more likely to be reached than rural students. And lastly, the role of government. Learning assessments, which were key, were generally only achievable when the government was behind them. So what have we learned for future interventions? There's a delicate balance between timeliness, quality assurance, and ensuring vulnerable groups. This needs to be studied and maintained in future. I just mentioned technological capabilities. There's scope for more research on this topic and making sure evidence is integrated into granting criteria in future. I mentioned at the start some struggles with ensuring the availability of MEL data. This is really due to some of the struggles we had with accountability. And I should mention, not accountability, but making sure that there was communication between grant agents and GPE. So the MEL reporting processes were timely, but at the same time, it wasn't always possible to go back and look at things from a more qualitative perspective and evaluate that last mile of delivery. What does this mean for potential criteria for future granting? Emergency interventions that also address long-term resilience needs are generally a better use of resources. We know this from our study. Margarita just provided an example of a country where, this was Tonga, where some of the facilities were used later. And I think this is something we've seen across many of the grants. Lastly, we also know that emergency grants with similar and more focused goals, pre-existing coordination mechanisms, and strong procurement practices are likely to reach their goals. This too needs to be reflected in granting criteria.
Lorenzo,
I'll stop
can
here
I
for a
ask you to
moment.
speak quite slowly for the rest of the presentation, just to ensure the interpretation can be done into French? Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. I'd like to just go back to some of the points I shared earlier on effectiveness, because I think some of these are key. What are some of the other success stories we can talk about? I mentioned earlier the role of coordination. I'd like to bring up the case of the DRC. Coordination with UNICEF, thanks to existing relationships, is what allowed most of the targets in the DRC to be met. And we saw this across several other countries as well. Another example I should highlight is the role of pre-existing experience with COVID-19 and with pandemics more broadly. As we know, Ebola struck some of the countries in West Africa that are part of our sample. So generally, the hope was that pre-existing experience would determine the success of some of the grants. Ghana was the case where we looked at this most closely, but unfortunately, what we found was that experience was not always a factor. And this has to do with the lack of digital skills on the one hand, and on the other hand, lack of adequate technical capabilities around learning management systems. Ghana was leveraging the Edmodo solution, which had not been used in the past, and it took almost a year to get that up and running. So there's a concern that even previous experience is not enough to overcome some of the digital bottlenecks I mentioned earlier. Coordination I mentioned earlier. An example I'd like to bring up is Micronesia. So of course, Micronesia is a confederation of islands with a highly decentralized governance structure across a large swath of territory. And that was a key bottleneck in rolling out some of the learning solutions. I'd also like to go back to the issue of building back better. As we'll see in in our first thematic section later today, digital skills, learning management systems were often bottlenecks. And so the investments in some of these areas did not yield an immediate return. At the same time, we have to see this as a long-term investment too. What we heard from many of the stakeholders at country level was that although these countries weren't necessarily benefiting in terms of learning outcomes in the short run, in the long run, this is helping build resilience, it's helping upskill teachers and ensure stronger outcomes over the long run. I should also mention the role of government support around learning assessments. So although the bulk of teacher training support was around guaranteeing continuity of learning, a lot of it was also directed at school administrators and teachers around learning assessments. I think this has been really key around helping contribute to the evidence base. What we know is that, as Margarita mentioned, learning outcomes plummeted over the pandemic, but of course measuring this is key, and it probably falls under the category of some of the more achievable activities, provided there's adequate government support. Lockdown timing is something I touched upon earlier, and I'd like to discuss more in detail. Lockdowns weren't predictable. School closures were generally thought to be short at the start of the pandemic, but then often turned out to be longer than planned. This sometimes determined the success of the grants. And we even had cases where longer lockdowns were actually beneficial to grant outcomes because implementers had more time to roll out some of the solutions. So again, I think unpredictability, the fast evolving nature of the pandemic, as I mentioned earlier, were some of the key factors we need to think about. Just on the role of having fewer objectives with grants, what we saw on average was that countries pursued roughly 3 or 4 goals, ranging across a diverse spectrum, and some of the countries that pursued more goals, sort of at the front end of the bell curve, 5 or 6, generally were those that were likelier not to meet any of the targets, or very few of them. And countries that focus on 1, 2, or 3 generally met those targets. So I think this should also cause us to reflect upon whether this should be a granting criterion, whether we should be thinking about how many objectives are being pursued at a given time. I'd like to just go back briefly to recommendations before handing it back to Anna Maria. How do we ensure that grant processes are striking that balance between approval, quality assurance, and ensuring vulnerable groups are targeted? Vulnerable groups is the key one here. It's very hard to design activities that do this when you only have very little time to design the activities themselves. I should note that at the start of the GP COVID-19 grant rollout, there was a first come, first served basis award for the AF grant, which was shortly discontinued. What we saw was that the requirement to at least address one vulnerable group was broadly met, but it was very hard to measure whether this was the case further on throughout the duration of the grants. So what we might want to reflect on is whether that criterion is purely the inclusion of vulnerable groups, or whether there should also be requirements to guarantee measurability throughout. And we need nuance here as well. Ensuring countries' technological capabilities are met can't just be based on a self-assessment. There's also a question here around a more objective assessment. 80% of the grants relied on low to mid-tech solutions, but 20% did on high-tech solutions. And in some cases, we had countries, I think in Somaliland, almost 40% of the continuity of learning funding went to high-tech solutions, which was not necessarily achievable in such a low-tech context. So clearly, future granting by anyone needs to account for this more thoroughly. I'm going to stop here. Apologies for going back and forth. Anna Maria, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Lorenzo. We do have a Q&A box available for the audience to share any questions that you might have. For now, I'm not seeing any questions in it, but I do invite you to look at the link that has been posted in the QA box, which leads you to the full evaluation report. So if you're interested in learning more, please do have a look. But if there are no more questions, I would suggest we move on to our first thematic session on distance learning. And if questions come up on the evaluation, you can still put them in the Q&A box, and Lorenzo can remain here on the line for a little bit to answer them in writing. All right, so Lorenzo, could you take your slides down? Perfect. So I will just briefly share here our next session. Great. So could I invite to the virtual stage Evans, please?
Thank you. Thank you, Anna Maria. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first panel discussion for this webinar. It's on distance learning. My name is Evans Atis, and I work at the Global Partnership for Education as the Technology for Education thematic lead. During this session, we will reflect on the current evidence base on the use of technology for education. We will draw the lessons we have learned from the policies, approaches, and processes that were adopted to deploy low and high-tech solutions to support teaching and learning. And of course, we all have heard in the previous presentations, a speech by Margarita, some success stories in the previous interventions on how countries supported learning continuity under difficult conditions. But we all have also heard of challenges, mainly related to the digital divide and learning loss during the pandemic. We will therefore discuss issues around equitable access to technology and the extent to which all children were able to use technology to learn effectively. We will also look at opportunities to leverage past and current investments on technology to support education systems resilience and system transformation. And to discuss all of this, it's a pleasure to introduce our panel composed of various experts who have been working in different parts of the world in education. Our first panel member is, I will introduce them in the order that they will be speaking. Our first panel member is Dr. David Hollow. David is the research director for EdTech Hub. EdTech Hub is a global movement to mobilize evidence and support decision-making about how technology should be used in education. In his role as the research director, David oversees the Hub's portfolio of research and supports evidence uptake in policies and practices. He has over 15 years of experience and he has conducted studies in more than 20 countries. Our second panel member is Ms. Linda Jones. Linda is currently the Chief Education at UNICEF Innocenti. Innocenti is the UNICEF Global Office of Research and Foresight. Linda has extensive experience in evidence-based policy design and education programming, particularly focusing on learning for girls and the most marginalized children. Previously, she has led the Global Education Emergencies team in UNICEF headquarters. Our third speaker is Dr. Younghwan Bang. He's joining from South Korea. He's currently a professor at the Korean University Institute of International Education in South Korea. His research efforts focused on education technology and international education. Dr. Bang has a wealth of practical experience in digital education, innovation, policy design, and official development assistance in both the Asian and African regions. And previously he held positions as chief advisor and dean of strategic planning and global education innovation in various institutions. Our first speaker is Ms. Cicera Simon from the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, where she is currently the head of the Human and Social Division. In her capacity, she is responsible for strategic oversight and leadership of social inclusion and social protection, education, health, and youth development. Previously, she was the program director for the Regional Education Program. She has a wealth of experience in teaching, research, development of national and regional education sector policies. Our fifth speaker is Mr. Albert Nsengiyumba. He's the Executive Secretary of the Association for the Development of Education in Africa. In his current role, he has helped build strategic partnership with multilateral development institutions, regional economic bodies, and other organizations. Albert has a lot of experience also in education technology research, policy development, and implementation in Africa. And previously, he served in the government of Rwanda as Minister of State for TVET and Minister of Infrastructure. And our last speaker, we are very happy to have him with us, which is Alex Tinomugisha from the World Bank. Alex is a senior education technology specialist. In his current role, he leads the World Bank's knowledge and advisory services to governments on EdTech. Prior to joining the World Bank, Alex worked for leading private sector and non-governmental organizations on large-scale digital transformation in education in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So we have a great panel for you today. As we say, we encourage you to ask questions throughout, and we'll have a moment to also to answer some of the questions you might have. So we will start this discussion with David from EdTech. I hope everyone can hear me very well. So we just had a presentation, David, on evaluation of what happened during the pandemic. So reflecting on the previous presentation and other current evidence base, do the evaluation findings on distance learning resonate with what other evidence is telling us? You have 4 minutes, David.
Sure, thanks, Evans. And hi, everyone. It's really nice to be with you today to be able to contribute to this conversation. I think what we heard from the evaluation report that Lorenzo just summarized is a lot of common threads from the experience of EdTech Hub in responding to COVID as well. So as Evan said, EdTech Hub exists to build better evidence for how technology can be used to improve education, specifically in low-income countries, and then to ensure that decision makers can have access to that evidence to influence policy and practice. And so as we saw the mass school closures with COVID-19 spread, it was really clear for us at EdTech Hub that we needed to act fast, as has been GP have been commended for as well. Distance learning became the norm. So this question of evidence that you raise, Evans, in relation to distance learning was really front and center for us. As Mark West, our colleague at UNESCO, said early on during the pandemic, the global community really entered the largest ever EdTech experiment there had ever been. It was an unplanned experiment, an unwanted experiment, but an experiment nonetheless. And as distance learning became the norm, the demand for rapid evidence went up rapidly. So the 3 things we did, which relate to the evidence, we worked really closely with governments directly, had teams embedded with ministries, trusted voices, as stressed, time-poor senior decision makers had to pivot fast and make hard decisions, making the evidence available to them. But secondly, there was a lack of accessible evidence available. So, okay, so what is the best evidence we currently have about how to use technology well in mass distance learning? So we produced a series of rapid evidence reviews on the most relevant topics so that decision makers could have access to the best of the current evidence that was already there on how to make TV-based education, radio-based education, distance learning for children with special educational needs, for refugees, all different key crucial priority topics, saying let's package that evidence for them quickly in ways that are a bit more accessible than trawling through academic journals. It had to be on things that mattered, and it had to be accessible and quick. Then the third thing that we did was similarly to what's been noted already. We recognized there was a lot that wasn't known, and there was a need for rapid primary research to take place. So we commissioned 10 studies, and I think that's what links in both to your question, Evans, around the evidence base and what's been heard. So there really is a lot of overlap in terms of the evidence on distance learning and the broader evidence on EdTech. We'll talk about it a bit later on in the conversation as well, but the headline findings from our studies that I'll share in the chat as well. Common principles still apply. We need to design first for the most marginalized students. We need a multimodal approach. We can't assume that one size will work for all. In a context of distance learning, personal connection, well-being, and safety need to be front and center. Aspects of effective education, which we know from the wider evidence are crucial, remain so within distance learning. For example, the role of teacher professional development has been crucial through the research that we did. Also, recognizing the nuances of how best to involve parents, siblings, and carers within home-based learning. So that was the headlines from our studies. I'll put the links in the chat. I've got in the final 30 seconds, I think just to say there's a lot of overlap between the findings in the evaluation of the GPE work and the research findings from the hub. So those common threads are there. A lot of the evidence is really consistent. The main challenge is that applying evidence in a crisis is very, very difficult. We are all so familiar with that. It's a cross-sector challenge. It's not just specific to education. So I think later on we'll come back to that, thinking about, okay, even if we know what the evidence is, how do we make sure we're looking to the future in a way that we can prepare to ensure that that evidence is accessible, and the kind of tactics and strategies that we might be able to use to know that next time we face a large-scale crisis and have to rely on distance learning or other educational tactics, we will be able to have that evidence really accessible for decision makers to be able to make good decisions. Evans.
No, thank you very much, David. I think two things or three things you mentioned around the principles and also around thinking about education goals, because technology is being used for something, not for itself, and also involving communities. It's very important. And turning to you, Linda, based on those 3 points also, where do you think we have emerging consensus on what approaches to technology deployment for access and learning worked and how they work or didn't actually? Yeah. So where do you see any consensus? Yeah.
Thanks very much, Evans. Well, before I come straight to the point, so throughout the COVID-19 pandemic at UNICEF, we were working with partners, including many partners across the world, but also including UNESCO, the World Bank, with GPE to track the distance learning responses and gather the lessons from many countries to share with other countries, specifically because of the point just made that there wasn't enough evidence about. So it was creating evidence as it was being put in place at the same time and tracking in real time the not just the efforts, but also to whatever extent we could, the impact of those efforts too. So unfortunately, we do know that an awful lot of children were not reached at all throughout the COVID pandemic with any distance learning or remote learning opportunities. But there are really good stories out there as well. Some of the challenges, of course, are well documented, not just the equity issues, but also access to devices and the cost of accessing some of those devices. And that's not just high-tech solutions, that's also where TV programs were being used, competing schedules on radio programs. And of course, the cost of connectivity being prohibitive to many students and teachers as well across the world. So that importance of prioritizing action on the infrastructure, while at the same time working to reduce the cost of data for students and teachers, was really important. And some countries did that very well. East Timor is a case in point where negotiations were in place to eliminate the cost of data for teachers and students at that extraordinary time. A good example of the mismatch, perhaps, of some of the efforts were in Bangladesh. Less than 6% of the households in the poorest wealth quintile had TV, but 92% owned a mobile phone. But despite this, mobile phones were the second least reported modality used by the Ministry of Education to deliver any remote learning, and radio being the least used. So as governments continue to invest in that infrastructure, education actors, ministries of education, it's about developing distance learning modalities that leverage the technology that households currently have access to, whilst improving that access to other modalities, of course, as well. Mobile phones can really be utilized, and we saw this in the successful programs of making distance learning more interactive. Almost all countries reported using mixed modalities, multiple modalities for distance learning, the most popular, of course, being paper-based, but backed up with other sources, and how those modalities interacted with each other was really very great importance. So was the meaningful interactions between teachers and students. Teachers are critical for successful distance learning, and that teacher training and preparedness, which couldn't happen in many cases in the COVID response, well, that needs to be improved. A survey from India in 2020 found that limited teacher-student interaction was the most cited reason for dissatisfaction with distance learning, and vice versa, of course. And that includes best practices for the use of distance technology in learning. That's not only to prepare teachers and facilitators when schools are closed, but also to improve skills to incorporate into lessons when schools are open too. The broadcast media, that really needs a big plan for interaction and feedback. When it's just sent out to a passive audience, it's very hard to tell the impact of that. So using the mobile phone again is a great opportunity. But the balance between that digital learning bandwidth and the well-being of the child is really important too. One size doesn't fit for all students, and programs need to be developed for different ages and varying digital skills. Very difficult to do in the onset of an emergency, and something that really needs to be planned out. Developing the modalities that can be used offline is really important as well. If you think about your modalities being able to reach the most marginalized, or the children with the minority languages, or particular subsets of society that would be missed out normally, if you can design your programs for them, then you're probably going to get the maximum reach for that technology. And this is paper-based as well. If you can design your logistics around reaching those hardest to reach with paper-based, it's probably going to reach everyone. I'll leave it for there now, Evans. I'll come back to some of the points later in the panel as well, if that's okay.
No, thank you. And I think you laid out very well in terms of like multiple modalities, mixed modalities, and also the role that teachers and the feedback system that needs to exist, because technology cannot do it on its own. And in the name of the equity principle, that's very good. And these are like emerging consensus that we've seen. We even saw other studies around the use of mobile phone, but we do know that we have evidence gaps, and David said that, and you mentioned that. So maybe I will bring Dr. Beng from Kenyan University to tell us where he sees any lack of evidence, what we don't know yet, or how technology works, and how it doesn't work, or how it works. What is the gap, the evidence gap that we are seeing? I don't know if Dr. Beng is with us, but if you're with us, you can turn on your camera and tell us, where do you see any lack of evidence in the use of technology for education?
Okay, let me just connect to the my AirPods. Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Maybe speak a little bit louder.
Okay, all right. So let me check the mark. Okay, so I think the reflecting on the GPA's COVID-19 response, the summative evaluation report, that reveals critical insight into the effectiveness and some limitation of the intervention employed. I think overall, while the initiative were largely relevant and well received in our partner countries, there are some existing gaps in evidence regarding three major gaps. One was the first one is the long-term impact and the adaptability to evolving pandemic conditions in each countries, and specific outcomes for vulnerable groups. So to elaborate those three areas, I think the long-term impact and sustainability. This evaluation and the GPE's response highlighted the immediate relevance and coherence of the GPE support mechanism. However, there is lack of comprehensive evidence regarding the long-term impact of these interventions on educational outcomes and the system resilience in those partner countries. And these include limited data on the sustainability of implemented measures and their efficacy in fostering the learning post-crisis. And the second is adaptability to evolving conditions during the COVID-19. So which means, despite the initial relevance of the grant design to pandemic condition, there is insufficient evidence on whether the intervention adapted effectively as the pandemic evolved. The rapid onset of COVID-19 required dynamic responses in every, it also very different from one country to another, but the documentation and suggests a static approach without substantial revision to adapt the changing circumstance, there was another gap. And the third one, the last one, was the outcomes for vulnerable groups. I think the other panelists also mentioned, but while the efforts were made to address the needs of vulnerable groups, including girls and children with disabilities, the evaluation indicates a gap in systematically tracking and reporting outcomes for these populations. I think that there is a notable absence of disaggregated data that would provide clear insight into the effectiveness of intervention tailored to these groups. And I think that there are two more the gaps that I could add. Although the GPE response was marked by fast mobilization and allocation of funds to respond to the COVID-19, there's limited evidence on the efficiency of fund utilization across different initiatives and contexts. The evaluation points out variability in grant utilization rates, which suggests potential disparity in how effectively resources were deployed. The last one is kind of a integration with the national system of each country and globally international aid environment. While the GP support aimed to align the national education system and broader international aid effort, the evidence of coherence and the integration of this effort remains very limited and sparse. This includes a lack of detailed analysis on how GP initiatives complement other international and national response to the pandemic. So overall, I think as I mentioned earlier, the GPE's the COVID-19 response initiative was overall relevant and well received and effective. However, still there are some the notable gaps in evidence regarding long-term impacts, adaptability during the COVID-19 pandemic time, and also the specific outcomes for the vulnerable groups. So I think those three or two other gaps, like efficiency and utilization fund and integration of national and global international aid system, how this response is integrating. I think those 5 topics could be the gaps for after reflecting on this summative final report. That's pretty much my answers for now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Meng. Thank you, especially the point around effectiveness and sustainability. I think this is something the whole sector is trying to address, and it's something that we're all dealing with. like how we make sure that technology is linked to learning goals. So that's really something that should be at the top of the agenda of the sector, and also the whole issue you mentioned around equity, making sure for which group technology works best, and to make sure that we capitalize on that. This is very important. Now we are moving on to how we countries or regions were able to address the impacts of COVID. Maybe I will bring in Miss Sarah Simon and to tell us more how countries from Eastern Caribbean, how they really prioritize certain types of technologies in their response. And also you can tell us how the countries, strategize to address equity. And also feel free to tell us about the challenges that they face and how they overcome these challenges. You have 5 minutes.
Hi, pleasant good morning, and thank you, Yvonne. To start off, just sharing just to share, this grouping of 11 member states are actually archipelago of Caribbean states placed between North and South America. If you look on the map, we start at the most southern, that being Grenada, and all the way to the northern part of this archipelago, you have Anguilla. Very small states with approximate combined population of just about 1.7 million persons. In addressing the issues at hand with COVID, what it really caused us to do is to really advance our efforts to move into or introducing technology in education. And so when COVID came about, really affected us in the region in March of 2020, we immediately set out to undertake a quick research to really inform how we should move forward. And our findings reveal that, one, in selecting or prioritizing any technology, we needed to consider the teachers' familiarity and competence with the technology. This played a significant role. What we also found at the time, early on from the onset of COVID, is the fact that most teachers had gravitated towards Zoom, which meant that they were very much familiar with it. And also WhatsApp groupings. There were existing WhatsApp groupings. So social media also played. So we saw that teachers had already created those groupings with their parents and with students. And so they capitalized and used this to share information. And that is those who had access to this grouping, because not every family with access to a cell phone, or more importantly, data on those cell phones. That was critical. We also found that we needed to prioritize a vehicle, a platform whereby students, parents can access content. That was critical. And what would teachers' preferred virtual learning environments? Yeah, that would provide readily available, culturally relevant, curriculum-aligned content. And that was a major setback for us. While there was quite a bit of content available online, finding relevant, culturally relevant content aligned to some of the standards or the priorities of the curriculum, objectives of the curriculum, that was difficult. So we immediately set out to engage teachers, teacher educators in creating content and making content readily accessible and available. We also found that in prioritizing, we needed to ensure that there was alignment between our teacher training programs and specific programs or platforms. That really helped drove the adoption, because most teachers, the teacher education programs, offers media, a course in media and technology, and quite a bit is being done in there, and teachers were very much engaged and very much exposed. So in informing or prioritizing, we needed to take this into consideration. And through, of course, GPE's support, we engaged with our national training, teacher training institutions to develop a specific course for distributed learning or to enhance teacher pedagogy in delivering learning, of course, using those various platforms. The fourth that really informed our prioritization was, importantly, we heard from teachers and also parents the functionalities of the platform to really support instructional needs. As such, content management and learner tracking was an important consideration. So although there were other secondary factors like the ease of use, we found that hearing from teachers and hearing from parents that we really needed to see how we manage ensuring that our platforms are able to really take on that content management that young persons are able to access, our learners, but importantly, the frequency to which our students were utilizing those platforms, and what were they really engaging in. It's really to inform how we start to improve what was available and better respond, importantly, to the students. The two last points on this really was to ensure that the existing platforms, we deliberately made an effort to pull from those teachers their feedback from existing learning management systems that were in use, and what would they like to see, what they believe was the immediate need for those, and what would they like to see in the future. And so that too really assisted us in guiding the OECS Commission, guiding member states on the prioritization and the selection of various platforms. And of course, there were largely a large set of students and teachers who were set aside from having low-tech solutions, were really focused on, for several reasons, access to those students, and of course, the unavailability of the technology, that wide digital divide, the paper-based access. While all of these factors were taken into consideration to inform how we move, we recognize that with all of the member states, in one way or another, they were using different learning management systems. They were at different levels to access to technology or content. And as a collective, we agreed to develop a set of guidelines, and again, through GPE's support, that would guide member states in the selection or use of current, because a number of member states recognized they needed to advance those in ensuring that there is a suitable learning management system. So those guidelines were developed to assist member states in making their selections and really prioritizing. As it pertains to our...
Yes? As we will have a lot of time to talk about the investments actually later. You can keep your, because I think you raise a lot of interesting aspects around the use of evidence as a key principle, the alignment of content, and also the getting teachers at the center and communities. Maybe I will move to Africa, to ADEA, Albert from ADEA. Will talk to us about how did that happen in Africa, because we know that the coverage was one thing, and also the learning loss. I know it wasn't a big. We have recent studies that says that schools that face longer closures, the losses were equivalent of more than like around 12 months worth of learning. Maybe I will ask Albert and Sengiumva to come in to tell us how the deployment of technology took into account children's learning assessment and ensured they were making progress in their learning process. And any challenges also welcome to discuss. Albert, I don't know if you're...
I'm online, and thank you. Thank you, Evans, for inviting me. It's a very, I've been following the discussion, very interesting discussion. Before I move into your question, the reality, hearing from colleagues here from different, is that we see evidence being generated, but the challenge is how do you translate those evidence into action to inform technology deployment with the aim of actually improving the learning outcome. I think that connection is still coming out out of this intervention. So when we consider the context of Africa, ADEO was hosting what is known as the COVID-19 Observatory, where we conducted a number of engagement with countries, working with partners to try and better understand how countries are responding to the impact of COVID-19. So, for example, the consideration of learning assessment in technology deployment in African countries was linked to both policy and practice consideration. So in terms of policy, based on our initial engagement with African countries and at the onset of the pandemic, technology deployment focused more on responding to the learning disruption and pushing for the continuity of learning remotely during the school closure. So the evidence from the KICS Observatory on COVID-19 responses by educational system of about 40 African partner countries, or GPE, shows that learning assessment was not a priority at that time, especially considering that technology deployment was unveiled due to disparities of rural-urban, socioeconomic status of parents, vulnerable groups, and so on. This trend continued during the pandemic, and learning assessment occurred mostly in private schools that already had the technology infrastructure in place before the pandemic, and also some form of ongoing technology based on a number of factors. So the fact that's a reality that we found in many of these countries. So let me pick an example. So for example, in Kenya, the policy decision was to focus on revision during the pandemic and to take up new learning topics upon schools reopening. In most of African countries, priority was given to the examination classes as a key factor in the first instances of school reopening. This is why the findings of poor performance in this area in the GP evaluation is not at all surprising. So the question, I think, for most countries was how to prioritize, knowing that technologies was not something that could actually embark in. There were some requirements to be able to engage in technologies. In some cases, there were also what I would have called more or less opportunistic opportunities. So opportunistic by meaning looking at the possible technologies available. So when I take the example of Ivory Coast, they managed to rely on television with a good coverage. But that was not easy to create interactions, as our colleague from UNICEF was pointing out. So mobile phone became at some point the only option when interaction could actually be facilitated. While in countries like Morocco, they managed to use a mix of technology for the continuity of education and assessment where possible. So let me stop here. Maybe I should come in at some point for more questions. Thank you.
No, thank you. And I like the point about linking technology to policies and practices. And also we know prioritization is an issue, and making sure that when we say linking technology to practice and policies, it has to do with learning, basically. How do we incorporate assessments functions within those technologies in a way that help us track progress? That's very important. On this, we now let's look ahead a little bit. GP alone has invested almost like $500 million during the pandemic to support more than 66 countries. Maybe Alex from the World Bank, you can tell us how we can collectively leverage the investment made in COVID for more resilient systems, because we know GP invested, but other partners invested, countries invested. How do we leverage that investment to build more resilient systems going forward?
No, thank you, Evans, and thanks to the panel. Let me start by defining resilience and putting this into context. So, most people think of resilience as disruption of school or schooling. We're expanding that definition to include disruption of learning. So that includes situations where children are in school, but they are not learning for whether they are not teachers or untrained teachers. It's also important to note that unfortunately the need for resilient systems is probably more urgent than ever. The pandemics are not likely to go away. In fact, they are likely to increase due to climate change. I think we often don't realize that almost every single day, or most days, schools around the world are closed because of some sort of climate-related event. We know the flooding that affected a few countries. One big one is conflict. I think the UN Secretary General recently said that about a quarter of humanity is living in a conflict zone, and that we've never had more conflicts than 1945. So this is a big challenge because it affects schools. We have about 260 million children still out of school that need to be addressed. And finally, we're really worried about achieving SDG 4, especially universal secondary education in some of the low and middle income countries, right? I mean, I don't think we are going to build schools and hire and train teachers fast enough to address that necessary increase in enrollment and obviously learning. So we can use the investments made during COVID to address some of these issues. The good news is that countries from, we're looking at the World Bank portfolio as an example, have not stopped investing. In fact, countries still are investing in resilient education technology. Almost every country has some experience now. I think the evidence is growing. We see this in Rwanda, that's doing a resilience policy, in Uganda, where they're making investments in their learning management system, in Senegal, where they've repurposed their investments to address out-of-school youth, in the Sahel, where they're also trying to do something similar, and more recently in the Sudan, where they're trying to use those investments, not forgetting places like the Ukraine. So the investments that were made, and I think the point that a lot of the panelists made was that, you're more likely to be successful if you have some of the basics in place. Let me end by saying, what do we need to do more of to make these investments a reality? Linda, David talked about the mobile phone. I think it was a missed opportunity during the pandemic. I think we need to do more around the mobile phone. I think that we need, and collectively here as development partners, as countries, I think every country needs a learning continuity and recovery plan. As we do the next set of education sector plans or policies, we really do need to include a continuity plan. That everybody needs to be aware of what happens if my child, from the parent, if my child can't go to school, the student needs to know what happens, the teacher needs to know what happens. And these, all businesses have continuity and disaster recovery plans. I think the education sector, it's high time that we had something about, learning continuity and recovery. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Alex. Now, that's good that you mentioned the fact of that we need to have the basics in place. And from a global perspective to a regional perspective, and we know in the Caribbean, we have recurrent crisis. And maybe Cicera, can you please come up and share with us how countries in Eastern Caribbean are capitalizing on these investments for the future, given the risk, of recurrent disasters, natural disasters in the region?
Thanks for that, Evan. Immediately, from the onset, I should indicate, from the rollout and receipt of the grant support from the Global Partnership for Education, we built into the program the idea of or development of a sustainable plan. And it was agreed by member states that we need to ensure we move alongside our face-to-face mode of schools operations, that we move towards a digital learning ecosystem. And so one would ask, what is included, may ask, what is included in this digital learning ecosystem? We thought at the heart of it, we needed to ensure that we first of all build on or take the advantage of the existing opportunities from COVID. A lot of effort had been spent into developing content, relevant, culturally content. And so in that ecosystem, create opportunities or the design for the interconnectedness, to facilitate interconnectedness between, among, in fact, content development, curriculum, and professional development. So in that digital ecosystem, we have ensured that all of our content is there, and we continue to develop and add content. We are currently developing a revised primary school curriculum, and we have created a digital version of that curriculum, which is also part of that digital ecosystem, and move our professional development to more than just face-to-face opportunities, but even self-paced professional development. Create a space within there so that teachers continue to engage in meaningful professional development. That has been one aspect of it. What we've also done, we recognize the need for improving connectivity.
I think we
were able to take a look at the connectivity, the levels of connectivity or bandwidth at school level. We recognize that it is really insufficient across member states to support pedagogical teaching and learning at the classroom level. So we have begun efforts in assisting member states in exploring, for instance, financial models that would assist schools in increasing bandwidth that would allow for more teaching and learning happening in this space. While this is really one of our major issues, getting to agree on a financial model and really getting to advance this, notwithstanding, in recent times, we completed a resiliency study in one of our member states, and in the coming weeks, we would be in a good position to release that data. We have also sought to ensure that we really sustain some of the outcomes from this, set aside from ensuring teachers continue to be developed, set aside from ensuring students have access to content, the connectivity. We have been taking a closer look at even the devices. Which devices are available, and how do we ensure that every child has access to a device? That we've been working very closely with our governments with, as we recognize that most devices, they have a shelf life of just about 5 years, and there is need to constantly upgrade those. But how do we, as a grouping of OECS countries, take advantage of the economies of scale that would ensure that we have a cheaper cost to those devices? The maintenance of those devices, we're also focused on that, upgrading and maintenance. And importantly, how do we really manage the e-waste from having all of those in the region? So these are some of what we've been doing, but at the heart of it, as I indicated, has been all of this investment from COVID. What we have been doing is to consistently and continuously operate within that digital space. So in the event that any other calamity of that nature to our region or any part of the world, we are able to better respond and not be on the receiving end where we were just about a little under 5 years ago.
Thank you very much, Cicera. That falls well with what Alex was saying about having a built-in plan to build resilience, to recover, and it shows that the Caribbean countries are already doing that. That's very great. Going forward, Linda, I will probably ask you that question. So what should we do differently as a sector to be better prepared for future crises? We saw that in the Caribbean, there are a lot of things that are already happening. What else could we do to be better prepared?
Thanks very much, Evans. I really want to emphasize COVID-19 as similar to Ebola or avian flu that affected some countries where schools were shut. Extraordinary shutdowns where children could not interact with each other outside of school, even when they were closed, where teachers were not able to interact with each other. There are many reasons why schools may be closed in the future. Some of them may be health related, similar to COVID, but hopefully not. The well-being of the child needs to be central to the designs of any solution for when schools are shut. And that's much easier to do when you can have other options for peer interaction outside of the school day as well. But building that in central to the design, the protection of the child, the well-being of the child, and that children are learning needs to be at the heart of what's being created or built on for the future. Future-proofing education systems is not easy. Forecasting lens to what may come in the future. 1.3 billion children living in areas that could be affected or are being affected and could be affected in the future by climate change is an extraordinary number. So the coordination that within countries and also within regions and globally will be super important as well, particularly on the infrastructure side of things. It's important to ensure that remote learning systems are available for students of all levels at times they can benefit from them. Priority needs to be given as well to children from the lower levels of primary and pre-primary who were the least reached throughout COVID-19. And that support for caregivers is also embedded into the designs. Teachers are pivotal. Caregivers are also incredibly important. We've talked a lot about the mobile phones. Having that combined as follow-up support for less interactive modalities is really important. It's also important not to discount the paper-based. It's not all technology. Paper-based will continue to be a major source of reaching children, even as supplementary to digital and technology. And so far in Bangladesh, facilitators of an accelerated learning program, they distributed paper-based materials and provided frequent short mobile phone calls to make sure that there was children learning off of those paper-based materials as well as the technology, and to give social emotional support to the children as well. These types of models take time to actually get everybody to understand their role within that model. Supply chains for everything need to be really well planned in advance, hopefully to be integrated into the system that's being used now, such as described in the Caribbean there. But actually making sure those supply chains will work when there was lockdown and people can't move from region to region or across even town lines. If those existing supply chains aren't in place already, that makes life very difficult. The support to teachers cannot be underestimated. They are crucial, and that needs to be really well thought out and designed with teachers involved in that development as well. They are key actors when it comes to, they are the key actor when it comes to children learning. So that regular communication channel between educators, families, learners, and policymakers is really important too. So in short, there's actually no one size fits all for distance learning, but what is important that we really learn from the experiences that children have had through the pandemic, and that it gets contextualized to really meet children's needs, and it's focused on equity first. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Linda. This multimodal approach is coming back, and well-being of children, involvement of teachers are really key. And of course, the supply chains on how to better manage this in terms of procuring devices and other materials. It's important. That's very true. Now, Dr. Ben and David, you both have 1 minute. Now you've heard what Alex, Cicera, and Linda just said about how to prepare for the future. So can you think of like 1 or 2 research items you think that would help us be better prepared for the future crisis? You both have 1 minute each to do so.
All right. Let me go first then. Okay, so yeah, thanks for sharing other panelists' idea and their opinions. But given the identified evidence gaps from the final report, I think I'd like to emphasize the one research area, the possible potential area is evaluating long-term educational outcome. So research should focus on the long-term impacts of pandemic-related educational intervention on learning outcome, retention rate, and progression. And this involves also studies to track students over time, so assessing both academic achievement and their socio-emotional well-being after COVID-19. And recently, I got a chance to study on the World Bank and GP's the larger scale intervention in Cambodia called the Secondary Education Improvement Project from 2018 to 2022. There was a COVID time, and then the one strategy they created was a school community strategy, enhancing the digital literacy, not only for the school setting, but also the community members and parents of the students and teachers as well. So after I conduct this case study, that might be some interesting idea that would like to share globally or others. So anyway, my comment was the research, the potential area for the research is a long-term educational outcome after the GP's response to COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ben. David?
Sure, thanks. So yeah, briefly to build on that, I think we've talked a lot about building system resilience, and I think the role of evidence and applied research in that is central. We want to see a culture change ultimately, whereby now and next time we face a large-scale school shutdown crisis, etc., that we have a culture of evidence-based decision making in EdTech established from the outset. That means, I think, an obsession really for the sector to answer the question and always demand answers to the question: how do we know we're spending our money on the right things that are going to have a cost-effective impact on children's learning outcomes at scale in a sustainable way? That's a really hard question to answer, but there are things we can do to ensure that we're starting to get more transparency around the cost of EdTech, and we're starting to map that onto consistent measures of student learning outcomes. And so we're actually starting to build up a picture of what's generalizable, what's context specific, and what's good wisdom for how technology really can be used cost effectively to improve student learning. So I think the more we can build up the culture of that kind of question being a default assumed part of any kind of decision making in EdTech, the more likely we are to see technology being a useful part of building education system resilience in future.
No, thank you. And also, Albert was saying that, countries were struggling in terms of prioritization, and also bringing evidence on how to do this prioritization is very important. And also, having the right questions and to bring the right answers, and also the how to is also very, very important. Ending on a positive note, I will bring in Albert. So Albert, can you tell us what innovative approaches to leverage technology for education that you've seen, and or you think education stakeholders across the world should learn from or embrace in the future? Any approaches you've heard of, or you've seen, or you've experienced yourself?
Thank you, Evans. And I think colleagues here have already alluded to this. I think the most interesting one is around the use of mobile phones. Looking at the mobile phone penetration in many African countries is really unprecedented, bypassing some of the infrastructural challenges that we know, especially in the continent. So education is leveraging this phenomenon through various innovative EdTech solutions from a growing EdTech community supported by government and key development partners. We have seen the emergence of EdTech hubs on the continent where young people are coming up with innovative EdTech solutions. The issue is therefore, how do we make that demand driven? And that's why the policy and practice by government become very important, just to align, the supply and the demand. I think that connection is a key. So that's really one thing. Of course, those EdTech solutions from a growing EdTech community supported by government are very important. The challenge that stem the tide of this trend include policies around the use of mobile phones in schools, a costly subscription that necessitates a deliberate engagement between government and mobile service providers for a zero-rated consideration for students. I was happy to learn what is happening in other parts of the world. I think we need to also to pick some of those good lessons moving forward. Secondly, the use of EdTech to facilitate access to training for teachers. I think I definitely agree with Linda. Teachers, despite innovation in technology, teachers are still at the center. So we definitely need to use technology to train teachers and ramp up the numbers. As you know, Africa continues to face a huge teacher shortage, and this could be one of the solutions going into the future. Lastly, as part of improving the resilience of educational system in Africa, ADEA has worked with countries to develop what is known as remote education benchmarking toolkits at different levels, from basic education, technical and vocational skill development, and higher education. This will enable countries to prepare better in minimizing disruption to education in Africa in future COVID-like situations. So those benchmarking tools are made of standards and norms in support of distance education. So we will be populating this, we will be engaging with countries to make sure that at least they have some references to use as they engage into remote learning as well. So let me stop here and thank you again for giving this opportunity.
Thank you very much. Oh, wow, that was great and it was very rich. We only have time for 1 or 2 questions. We already have 1 question and 1 comment in the chat box. There is one about evidence, and I think I made a comment earlier about how we prioritize, and there's a question about like what type of evidence should we be focusing on producing given that major uncertainty around like different crises that might come up. And should we focus on distance learning options? Should we focus more on project-based independent learning or other types of evidence? So I don't know who would like to come in. I don't know, David or Linda or any other participants in terms of the type of evidence we should prioritize based on the different crises we might be facing. David, do you want to go?
Yeah, happy to have a try. I think to be brief, types of evidence that we want to prioritize. I think so. A few headlines. We know that there are many different users of evidence, but we want evidence that is designed to be accessible for the intended audience. We need to distinguish in that between what evidence we think is generalizable and what evidence is context specific. That's really important. It's not a problem if evidence is only applicable to one context, but we need researchers to really be explicit about whether what they're producing is of generalizable use or is context specific, and how and why, focused on the detail. I think we need research which is confident that it is at the leading edge of knowledge. Too much of the research that we see being generated on the use of technology in education tries to do too much. It tries to answer too many different questions. It's very difficult for high quality research to be both broad and deep. So we advocate for research which does one or two things well. Really clear on what question you're trying to answer. What's your contribution to the puzzle of all the different evidence gaps? So specific evidence gaps targeted through accessible research with recognition of what's generalizable, what's context specific, and as much detail as possible within research on tactics and tools that are useful for those implementing EdTech and those making decisions about EdTech. That's all the kind of things that are good research for us.
Oh, Linda?
Yeah, just to complement everything David said, plus I would also say it's really important to have implementation research alongside EdTech that specifically are giving back evidence on, is it really reaching the people we need to be reached? And are children learning? If children are not learning, then what's the point for education programs? So these two fast feedback loops that can feed into and allow for change as programs are being implemented.
No, that's true. If there is one area where we need to apply this learn and adapt approach, it's within the EdTech sector, really, because we know everyone is promoting their own tool, their own products, but we definitely want to improve the ecosystems and the approaches to use those tools to make sure they have impact. We have another question from Maria. What great examples have you seen in developing great and relevant content that is available for the most disadvantaged during school closings? I think, Cicera, this question would go to you. And the second part of the question, what solutions have you seen to deal with achieving affordable zero mobile phone rates for the most disadvantaged?
Hi, Ivan. Sorry, but I missed the question. My connectivity somehow dropped. Do you mind just repeating the question? Are you able to hear me loud and clear?
Yes. So what great examples have you seen in developing great and relevant content that is available for the most disadvantaged during school closings? And what solutions have you seen to deal with achieving affordable or zero rated mobile phone rates for the most disadvantaged?
Yes, right here in the region, I think we have a very good example. Among the member states, we did have teachers across member states really volunteering to lead content development. So we set up various groupings of teachers and for various grade levels. So they would meet, develop the content. So that's one group. We then had groupings of experts, content area experts, and that's where we really brought on the teacher educators and other lead experts in various areas who really served as the quality assurers. They did the review of the created content, and we also had a third grouping. Once they were able to clear from the second level to get to the third level, again, doing another set of checks before we actually uploaded the content to our platforms. Even in doing this, what we recognize in recent times, we've brought on some, for instance, our interns. They too have serious contributions, and these are really young persons involved in uploading the content to the platform, but also taking another critical look. So we wanted to ensure, first of all, as I've indicated, that the content was relevant. We wanted to ensure that it's aligned to curriculum. We wanted to ensure that the content we're preparing, it's not simply for one specific grouping of nationals, but it's content that would allow teachers to adapt and to really make it their own. That is a good model, because what we have found is that teachers are excited and they continue to want to contribute to that content development. So that is one model that, of course, can be adopted. What we've done also with that model is we're seeking to move it one step further, how this contributes to your professional development. And that has been discussions, and with some teachers, they're actually reporting that work as part of their professional development activities, of course, with the evidence. So that's one that I definitely would recommend, and it is one that can be very sustainable if we continue to empower the teachers so they now can really take that ownership and work closely with parents.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Sister. That was very clear. We will have one last question before we close this. I think Carmela has a question. Carmela, do you want to come in to ask the question, or maybe let me just read it. So we saw that the EdTech community raising questions around trust and research during the Global Education Coalition in face of criticism that EdTech has been largely unresponsive to needs in classrooms in low resource context. More testing, earlier and 2 phases of iteration are needed, yet the spaces for such testing are not being open at country level or globally. So how do we overcome this and generate new forms of collaboration that support more responsive and relevant EdTech? For this one, Alex, do you want to come in here and share some thoughts with us if you have any? So the question would be more, how do we create space to test the solutions to make sure that they are relevant to the needs of the classrooms in low resource context, and how do we support that?
Yeah, sure.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is really important. This is an important question from Carmela, and I think that we have underinvested in local research ecosystems, in the universities, and the teacher training institutions that can conduct this research. Most often the research is really externally generated, and there are people on the ground. I mean, we have countries with teaching universities and research institutions that could really be integrated in this ecosystem. So one thing that we could do as a global community is to really promote and ensure that we invest in local research capacity, and that we make this connection between the local and international research. The other one is ministries of education as learning organizations. I mean, this is something that the EdTech team at the World Bank has been looking into more and more. And we see that the technology actually may have a role to play in terms of generating at least real-time data that can be analyzed for course correction. A lot of the technology today, you know, the education system produces a ton of data, right? And so we have not been very good at analyzing that data to date, and yet the analytical tools are now there, relatively widely available. So this is something that we could also look into. We've been discussing turning our regular education management information systems from just a data collection census type tool really to a more learning, accountability, and policy making tool. So that would be my quick response to that question.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for really this rich discussion. So I mean, looking ahead, I would say that we all know technology alone cannot build resilience or transform education, but we know if we make sure that it's complemented by the right policies, the right regulatory frameworks, the right technical standards, effective partnership, the right capacity, relevant content, and pedagogical approaches, it was mentioned here, sustainable financing, having teachers at the center, the well-being of children at the center, we have a better chance to build systems resilience. Thank you very much again for your attention. Let's move on to the next session. Ana Maria, I give you the floor back. Thank you again, all the panelists.
Super. Thank you so much to our great panelists just now. All right. I am just going to share briefly our speakers for the next session, which is going to focus on teachers. And I invite to the virtual stage Ramya, who will be moderating this session.
Great. Thank you, Ana Maria. And welcome everyone to the second thematic session on supporting teachers. My name is Ramya Vivekanandan, and I am GPE's thematic lead for teaching and learning. And if I can invite Sonia, I see already you have your camera on, Albert and Cristobal as well as Lorenzo, if you can also turn on your video. So before we kick off the session, let me just introduce what we'll be discussing by affirming, of course, that for GPE, as I think for all of us gathered here today, we recognize that teachers are central to strong education systems, and thus we prioritize quality teaching as a focus area and as a priority. And during the COVID pandemic, as we've heard and as we all know well, teachers were, of course, vital in the education sector response in ensuring that learning continued during the time of school closures, assessing that learning, both during the time that school was closed as well as upon reopening, and as well as providing students with crucial psychosocial support. But at the same time, teachers themselves needed support, both in terms of their own well-being, but also in relation to the training and professional development needed to rapidly pivot and deliver learning through untraditional means, be it in high, low, or no tech contexts. And thus, supporting teachers was a crucial feature of GPE's COVID-19 response. And we'll hear from Lorenzo, who'll tell us a little bit about some of the findings in relation to this support. And what's very interesting is that in relation to, or in comparison to some of the other domains, our partner countries faced greater difficulties in reaching their targets in relation to learning and to teachers and teacher training. So we'll talk about that and hear as well from our panelists. And so in this session, we are going to first hear briefly from Lorenzo and sharing some of these evaluation findings in relation to teachers and our support. But then we're going to essentially have a roundtable format, quite informal, with 3 speakers here, where we'll explore the range of interventions that our GPE partners undertook in relation to teachers. We'll consider the challenges as well as the lessons learned, and crucially, how these lessons are being applied in supporting teachers in the post-pandemic context, looking ahead. So before passing to Lorenzo, allow me to introduce our other 3 speakers. We have first Sonia Griet, who is an advisor at Education International, or EI. And for those who are maybe not familiar, EI is the largest global federation that brings together organizations of teachers and other education employees from around the world, representing in total more than 32 million teachers and education support personnel in 178 countries and territories around the globe. And they have more than 380 affiliate organizations. And during the pandemic, Sonia was appointed to EI's COVID-19 task team, which coordinated the organization's response. Next, we have Albert, who is very popular because we heard from him in the last session. We know that he's executive secretary of ADEA, and that he also served prior to this in the government of Rwanda in various cabinet positions, including as Minister of Infrastructure and Minister of State for Tibet. And Albert is also a very dear friend of GPE. So welcome again. And last but certainly not least, we have Cristobal Cobo, who is a senior education specialist at the World Bank, where he focuses on the effective and appropriate use of new technologies in education in middle and low-income countries and emerging markets. He has also in the past served as an associate at the University of Oxford, and he also holds a position of senior fellow for the Inter-American Dialogues Education Program. He's also the founder and former director of the Sebal Foundation's Center for Studies. And he has authored extensively on education, technology, and innovation. So very much looking forward to our conversation in this session. So let me start by inviting Lorenzo to share with us some of the high-level findings from the evaluation report in relation to teachers specifically. You're on mute, Lorenzo.
Thanks again, Ramya, and once again, great to be with you all here today. Before diving into what some of GPE's COVID-19 responses were concerning teachers, just a bit of background on distance learning, because a lot of the teacher training was around distance learning. Most of the distance learning activities regarded the use of either ICT, home-based learning, or tutoring programs. So if on the one hand, there were a lot of no-tech and print materials involved, you also had low-tech solutions such as radio and television, and medium to high-tech solutions such as tablets, mobile internet, and SMSs. There were also additional forms of support around curriculum standards, and learning material activities included educational content on which was home delivered, including learning kits. How much of the COVID-19 support budget was devoted to this? Distance learning covered around 11% of the total budget for AF grants. 34% went to the no-tech activities I mentioned earlier, and 66% went to the low to medium to high-tech activities I mentioned above. I should also add that low-income countries with average internet connectivities below 30% allocated around 80% of the budget to activities with the use of printing materials and radio and television. So broadly, technological solutions are aligned with the level of technological capacity, but not always. And we'll see how this affected teacher training. The first thing to look at is what were some of those teacher training activities. As I mentioned, teacher training to use these distance learning methods was the main one, but there were also teacher trainings on mitigating learning loss and supporting the return of teachers and officials to school. So there's a pedagogical element and a evaluation of learning loss element. Reaching the targeted number of teachers was challenging. Part of this was due to the short and reduced scope of many of the teacher trainings. And we know this is consistent with the global evidence base. But at the same time, it's challenging to do anything different when the pandemic is so fast evolving and you think there's so little time to actually adjust. Countries relying on portals and learning management systems struggled the most. The Ghana case is instructive. And I mentioned earlier how Ghana already had experience with Ebola. Ghana's Edmodo system was developed in November of 2020, so well into the pandemic, but operationalized only in 2021, once school reopening had already happened. It had many of the familiar challenges around digital skills, connectivity, and even then, of course, it wasn't used the way we had hoped because of timing. Teacher training to provide accelerated programs were actually less challenging in schools with longer school closures, with the median school closure being 167 days. Again, I should mention that challenges in teacher training were not unique to GPE grants and need to be contextualized with some of the broader challenges facing teachers in this period. For instance, with a disproportionate burden of household care being placed on female teachers, many of them quit their jobs, making it harder to target teachers and making it less likely for some of these GPE-funded activities to reach their indicator targets. I mentioned teachers, but not only teachers. Bangladesh was successful in providing training to teacher administrators and school heads, thus expanding the systemic scope of the intervention. Moreover, almost 2,000 primary teachers were trained to conduct learning assessments and provide remedial education. This was the first time this had occurred in the country. In the DRC, the AF grant made it possible to formalize and implement a priority intervention for the education sector's overall strategy. The overall success of the implementation has convinced the government to mainstream distance learning. Overall, what we're seeing is that while these interventions weren't always successful in the short term, they are also essentially a capacity development over the long term. And this is sometimes reflected in country-level policymaking. In the DRC, the AF grant made it possible to formalize and implement a priority intervention, which convinced the government to mainstream distance learning tools and make them a part of teacher training and in-service development. I'm going to stop here and hand it back to Ramya to open the floor to questions.
Thank you, Lorenzo, for that concise summary and for sharing those high-level findings. Thank you also for bringing in the nuance and the examples from the countries, which I think are really valuable. So then if I can turn to our three panelists, we will first be interested to know, broadly speaking, if you could each briefly summarize the main intervention or interventions that were carried out by your respective organizations in relation to supporting teachers in responding to the COVID pandemic. So we'll first hear from Sonia and then Albert and Cristobal, and you each have about 2 to 3 minutes. So Sonia, over to you.
Thank you, Ramya, and thank you for the opportunity given to Education International to join this important conversation. I just wanted to start because we in the previous panel and starting this one, we obviously talk a lot about pedagogy and distance learning and the challenges that teachers face in the classroom. I just wanted to start by acknowledging and remembering that many teachers died during COVID as they were doing their job, and I think that's a very important thing to remember as we think about future pandemics and how we support teachers. That means also making sure that teachers have a safe workplace and can deliver their teaching in safe conditions. And I think this is core to what Education International and education unions have been doing during the pandemic, trying to ensure that teachers were protected, that they were supported, and that they were listened. And I think this is what I'm going to insist on a little bit, because we haven't discussed that so much yet. But our role is to bring the voices of teachers in all these discussions about finding effective and sustainable solutions to crisis. So one of the first step we took was trying to document what was happening and what were the experiences of teachers and education unions on the ground. And so as many education unions did with their members, we ourselves surveyed our member organizations to try to understand what were their experiences across regions, what were the challenges they were facing, and in order to tailor our response to their actual needs. We also, at some point, because our member organizations, unions themselves, were documenting the experiences of their members, we were also reviewing the research that they were producing. So there was a wealth of evidence that was collected by unions themselves on the experiences of teachers during the pandemic. Based on that, we developed some support measures. I guess one important piece of support that we provided to our members was the development of some guidance that they could use in their dialogue with governments and employers. And this was around in the first week of the pandemics when we had the lockdown, and then later on when we started reopening schools. At some point we created the joint guidance with the OECD so that both governments and unions could work together on implementing solutions for teachers as we were in this hybrid situation of schools being open but still in the pandemic, and because of this need to constantly adjust the solutions. And then we try to facilitate an exchange of experiences and information across contexts, because of course the pandemic was impacting context differently, and the solutions adopted by different jurisdictions were different, and so there was a lot to learn from each other. So that was also a very important piece of our work, making sure that unions would know and learn from whatever was happening in other contexts. And then the last piece I would emphasize here was bringing these voices and these experiences to the policy discussion. So EI was, of course, involved in spaces like the GPE, but also working with health authorities, for example. This is something we usually don't do in normal times. But EI was working very closely with the WHO, trying to bring the teacher's perspective to the conversations around implementing the reopening of schools and health measures in education. And last piece of information in relation to this, which was really important when we think about the COVID-19 response in education, there was also the whole challenge around vaccines and access to vaccines, and the fact that in many parts of the world, communities had no access to vaccines. And for us, it was really important that as governments started designing and deploying their vaccination plans, teachers were included as priority groups, as frontline workers. And so this was also very, very important to us. So just to give you an overview of the different pieces of our response.
Thank you so much, Sonia. Over to you, Albert.
Thank you, Ramya, as moderator, and appreciate the invitation to attend this important webinar. So as a DARE, our support to countries during the COVID-19 pandemic comprised of two tracks. The first was country engagement at the onset of the pandemic to understand the policy and praxis at the practice level decision being put in place to ensure continuity of teaching and learning. We found a mix of intervention in the countries, including ad hoc teacher training on the use of technology for remote learning and the development modules to be used for radio and TV lesson delivery, the different online platforms and tools being used or not in the 9 African countries we engage in this particular survey. What was clear in the lack of preparedness by the education system, a phenomenon that was expected as the pandemic was a new entrant into our lives, with government trying the best to cope. The second part involved knowledge mobilization in the 40 African member countries. This was part of the GPE IDRC KICS Observatory that Adea was running together with the African Union CFR. In this regard. So, and we had a technical support from one of the partner that was supporting the APHRC, supporting the research aspect to help manage the KICS Observatory. So the key thing of this observatory was to provide evidence of the policy and practices response in the education sectors in these African countries, especially at the primary level, following school closures and the subsequent reopenings as the pandemic kept changing its behavior. So we use the evidence generated through the APHRC to develop knowledge products around learning assessment, teacher preparation, and well-being, among other areas, and use these products for peer learning, knowledge sharing, and uptake by policymakers. So I recall a number of webinars were organized around this, where we invited senior decision makers, particularly ministers, because I believe very much if changes and improvement to happen, we really wanted to make sure decision makers take the leads on this. And we could see engagement and also opportunities for learning from each other that was actually taking place around that time. And of course, at another level, we wanted also to make sure that we engage with middle decision makers in ministries and organizations, the parastatal, because the issue of policy in most countries is not only for ministers, it's also those technical people involved, on a daily basis, operationalizing policies to make sure that the policies are informed by the context, by the evidence. And that's really the engagement that we're involved in during the COVID, and we continue this journey moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least, Cristobal, in relation to your main interventions.
Thank you very much, Ramia, for the invitation. Very happy to be here, and I really celebrate this time for reflection, because it's very easy to always look forward and forget about the past. And I'm very pleased that we're having that opportunity, despite I understand not everybody is excited to talk about the previous pandemic. So I think a couple of quick reflections. Remote learning in general requires to align so many different components. Some people tend to think about technology and skills, but you have to do many other arrangements to be sure that this remote learning will be particularly impactful. An emergency, by definition, tend to benefit the ones who have been already working and preparing and developing the readiness before the emergency happens. And I think this was not the exception. So we have an interesting here trade-off between rapid response and effective response. So what we did was try to provide to countries the more useful information for them to take decisions how to effectively provide remote learning in different settings. And I think that's very important. So that we develop a number of we developed a program called Technology for Teaching, or T4T, which basically help countries to assess, depending on the context, the characteristics, the constraints, implementation capacities, what were the most impactful interventions that they would consider for either develop capacities among teachers, as well as delivering a higher impactful remote learning. So that went from analyzing hundreds of academic reports that were already documenting that, but also at the same time open during the pandemic a number of global contests to learn where the interventions were going to be more effective, more impactful, where there was more take-up, whether the cognitive development or the social-emotional were addressed by those interventions. So we got a massive response of over 400 applications from 80 countries, and we identified the ones who were more strongly supported by evidence to disseminate these impactful, that we call champion initiatives, to spread the word among others, to inspire others. So we put a lot of emphasis in decentralizing the guidance only from the World Bank, to bring the voice of others which were working in different contexts, with more or less implementation capacity, with more or less digital skills, to assess where and how that was useful. And I think this very comprehensive toolkit that I don't have enough time to explain it, was useful for people to have a much more a la carte technical support. And just to finish, I think in addition to all that, we did a number of exercises with the OECD to invite countries to share the emergency actions that they were taking that were going to be impactful to specific settings. So we had high, medium, and low income countries with implementations. And I think all that might have, to some extent, impact during the time, as Lorenzo was explaining, but many of these things are today, to some extent, sharing long-term developments at the country level.
Great. Thank you so much to all of you. It's so interesting to see the suite of different initiatives that were undertaken, from uplifting the voices of teachers, supporting their dialogue with government and employers, working with the health sector, crucially, all of the efforts around knowledge mobilization and dialogue with policymakers and leaders at different levels, the Technology for Teaching initiative, and everything that you've done, all of you, I think, in terms of facilitating that sharing between your different stakeholders. So thank you very much. We know that this work has been, though, hugely challenging. So I would now love to hear from each of you, starting with Albert, followed by Cristobal, and then Sonia this time. What were briefly some of the biggest challenges that your particular organization faced in this work of supporting teachers during the pandemic? Albert.
First, thank you, Ramia. Of course, there were a number of challenges, but the most important, the first and most critical one, was the lack of comprehensive data and information on government interventions, especially at the practice level, it made it actually difficult to provide comprehensive information for comparison. Secondly, it was difficult to engage some of the policymakers as they were busy trying to cope with the effects of the pandemic due to the pandemic challenging nature, and discovery necessitating the deployment of evolving intervention. So those are really two critical issues that I can at least speak from here. The lack of data and information, just to be able to take stock of efforts that are being made by countries. Because effort was put into coordinations at the country level. I remember at some points, the countries were trying to mobilize other stakeholders because the pandemic by nature was beyond the education itself. It involves so many other areas, including health, including security, including the needs to deliver, all kind of utilities and so on and so forth. So that was really the major priority for most of the country, for them to be able to share data and, more importantly, information in relation to the interventions. And of course, the issue of making sure that decision makers are able to set a time to learn from others, because we found in particular this observatory and the webinars that were accompanying it was a good opportunity for learning from each other and learning from others are doing to see how best that can inform intervention in specific countries. Thank you.
Cristobal?
Great, thank you. Well, in addition to what Albert has mentioned, that I think is essential, I think the challenges that we face can be organized in two pillars: hardware and humanware. So in terms of hardware, serious constraints in terms of access to infrastructure was something that was consistent almost everywhere, and even in middle-income countries, we saw that also when you make the decisions between urban and rural. So connectivity is, and unfortunately still will be for a while, a big gap here. But connectivity is not enough. I mean, the delivery of the access to devices, in many cases, households have one device for 5 members, so it was very difficult to use that as a learning tool. Appropriate platforms that can be used in environments with and without connectivity. Contents were not only open access, but also relevant for the country and in the language. And obviously a number of technical support to make all these elements to be well orchestrated, right? So at the hardware level, we saw a lot of constraints in terms of providing the appropriate support to ensure that all these conditions were in place. But there is the humanware part, which is obviously not a technical term, but the humanware put emphasis in all these capacities that needs to be addressed, right? Skills on the technical side, yes, absolutely. Digital skills are essential, but might not be enough. So if there's not strategies and tools to reach out to students who might be having a lot of anxiety or isolation, the technical skills won't give you all the support that you need. Communication was essential. Communication between teachers and students might not be synchronous, might not be all the time, but has to be regular. And also communication with the parents, which was a critical element to facilitate remote learning in many cases. So when parents were more involved, regardless of the educational level of the parents, that was a game changer, right? And I have to say that something that was consistent in every analysis we did during the pandemic, teacher burnout was a tremendous problem, right? The amount of workload, the amount of pressure and expectations, I think was something that put the teacher career at a very steep position. And finally, we saw a lot of challenges in terms of gender disparities. So a lot of mothers who were working from home and trying to arrange, because they were parents as well, or mothers, and that put them under a lot of pressure. So I think there's a combination of components that has to do with the infrastructure, but also with people, and the kind of support that each one of those needs is completely different.
Thank you. That's a great summary. And Sonia, last but not least.
Yes, thank you. We obviously faced similar challenges. Albert spoke to the lack of preparedness. I think we all dealt with this, and but I wanted to say that this lack of preparedness also meant that teachers and organizations of teachers had to step in very often and just innovate and just collaborate and just find solutions in many contexts until we started actually building responses. And I think for us, as we look forwards, it's very important that we think about how we really build on these experiences and on this leadership that teachers have been able to demonstrate during the crisis. For us, one big challenge was the variety of situations when it comes to union and government dialogue. We saw that in places where there was institutionalized social dialogue, or if there was not, places where governments took the phone and called union leaders when they started developing solutions, this really made a difference in terms of building sustainable responses. And so that was a great, we were, of course, we also had contexts where unions would learn from the news what was the decision for the day after and what would happen in the school. So that creates huge challenges. The digital divide was already mentioned, and we talked about this a lot, so I'm not going to get deep into this. I just wanted to mention the whole, Cristobal now mentioned the human dimension and the burnout, and this is actually something that was really huge in terms of teachers having to deal with this uncertainty. Now we look back and we make sense of it all, but as we were going through it, the guidance would change, them wearing masks in classrooms, children wearing masks or children not wearing masks. And so the whole uncertainty around the health measures, the fear that teachers were experiencing, because we also tend to think about the pandemic as this long closures of school. And obviously this is a big piece, but there has been a whole period of, hybrid situation where schools were reopening, but students had to isolate or suddenly everything was open, but the pandemic was going on. So there were very different situations, and teachers were fearing for their security. They were exhausted by the level of work they had to do, and they went through this struggle of serving the community, serving the kids, but also just surviving as humans and as individuals. And so this is also something, as unions, this was very very tricky, because and I think this is where the social dialogue and involving teachers helps finding the right balance and making sure that the solutions, even if they are effective, you also look at them through the lens of, are they sustainable for the profession to take on?
Great, thank you. It's interesting that, so much of what you're speaking of, I think, overlaps in terms of the experiences shared. So we've heard about the lack of data, the diversity of contexts, both in relation to that data, but for structures, for dialogue and consultation. Cristobal, the distinction that you made between hardware and humanware, I've never heard that term, but I think that's a great one. And, thinking about all of those human factors in terms of skills and capacity. And then Sonia, the themes that you touched on, teachers, not only as professionals, but as people trying to survive this pandemic, and the burnout and the stress and the need to innovate and take leadership in, largely a vacuum in many contexts. So these are all, I think, really, really important challenges for us to highlight and reflect upon. So we have just about 15 minutes before we have to wrap up. So I'm going to actually combine our last two questions, which anyway, I think are quite related. So it's about, taking stock, looking forward. And so it'd be great to hear from each of you what you think are the biggest lessons that your particular organization has learned in terms of supporting teachers during the pandemic. But, if we ever go through something like this again, looking forward, what are those lessons, and how would you apply those lessons to continue your work in this post-pandemic world? So Cristobal, this time we'll start with you, and then Sonia and Albert last.
Okay, so let's focus on the lessons. I think one big lesson was that not necessarily the highest tech will be the most impactful one, right? So there's always this trade-off between coverage and interaction. So there are technologies which are low cost, easy to access a lot of people, but if they don't address interaction, they might not be all that effective. So that brings a very complex challenge, because the continuity of learning that was addressed by many of our organizations put emphasis on access, but that doesn't mean necessarily on quality of the learning experience. And sadly, the results that we're seeing these days are a reflection of that. Lessons one, as being mentioned by my colleagues, one is building partnerships with governments and with other multilaterals is gonna be essential. So I think we can leverage a lot of lessons from what happened. Second is in the same line, and as Alberto and Sonia mentioned, data collection and data sharing is gonna be instrumental for taking decisions on what is working, what can be improved. Now, I think there are other factors that one of the lessons that we get is hybrid learning is not going to go away. We can change the name, but it's going to be permanent. Alex earlier was mentioning climate adversity and social disruptions can help us to get back to a much more flexible way of using the space and the time. On teachers, I think technical skills are relevant, but certainly not enough. So we have to, at the same time that we develop digital proficiencies, there are some adaptations. You cannot share the same curriculum that you share in person when you are remotely. So those changes are critical at the system level. And another factor that I think is essential is many parents really understood the complexity of the role of teachers only when they saw what they were doing at home, right? When the kids were trying to learn remotely. And I think that's an opportunity that we have to keep into account. What should we do to keep parents involved from now on? And finally, something that for me was essential is a kind of what we call digital paradox. Sometimes there are some policies designed to benefit the kids through digital tools, but those tools will be useful only for those who already have access. So you end up amplifying inequalities without even considering. And I think the baseline here of many of these lessons is well-being is not a side element, it's an essential one.
Great. Sonia.
Yes, it's very hard to summarize all the lessons, but I would say one thing that was mentioned in the previous panel as well is that it's came out very clearly of the pandemic that you can't, digital technologies are not going to replace teachers, and the human dimension of teaching and learning, I think, is something that we probably don't have to argue so much for anymore. And so as we, develop digital technologies, taking a human-centered approach to these, I think, is a big lesson that we take moving forward. The importance of unions, the importance of social dialogue, I already spoke to that, but really it helps addressing many of the challenges that we mentioned, designing solutions that work, designing solutions that are also timely and that can be adapted along the way, making sure that you build trust with the profession, because in many contexts, teachers would go to their unions rather than to their governments to get advice on how to be protected. And also, I guess one lesson that you can see in my background is that funding for public services is crucial, and this is something we've seen for health, for education. These were sectors where governments have stepped up their budgets, during the pandemic, and now, unfortunately, in many contexts, we also see that austerity measures are being taken, and so for us, it's important to continue stressing that funding education, investing in the profession is going to put us in a better place as we address new crises. And this is the only way we can have resilient systems. So we have now a big campaign named Go Public Fund Education on funding. And I guess this is one key lesson. And also I would say that, the most recent global initiatives like the Transforming Education Summit and the UN high-level panel on the teaching profession were, took the lessons from COVID. The teachers are really critical, and we as an organization, we really welcome the recommendations formulated by the panel, and we think they take on many of the lessons from the pandemic, from integrating a human-centered approach to technology, from considering teacher well-being, teacher mental health, many of these areas that weren't considered so much in the past, and for us they give us a clear path for action in the future, and we will make sure that we hold governments accountable to implement them, and so that we are, as I said, in a better place to approach the next crisis.
Thank you, Sonia. Albert, last but not
Yeah.
least.
Yeah, thank you, Ramya. In addition to what my predecessors have already, let me emphasize the need of partnership. I think that's really one of the things that became clear. The needs, especially during the pandemic, were huge. So there was definitely need to raise collaboration, to raise coordinations of efforts, more or less like addressing education needs in a multi-sectorial mode. So not just looking at a single sector, but multiple sectors engaging, partnering, and coordinating their efforts towards making sure education continue in such an important crisis. So that's really one thing that I want to emphasize, critical. Secondly, is also the issue of accountability, because there's a purpose. The purpose is really to improve education outcome. And therefore, there's a need for whoever involved being accountable. So from country, partners, and so on and so forth. That's really very important. And some of the effort that we are making right now is to raise accountability at both countries, but at partners as well. So because it's so that we can measure the progress and the impact we're making as stakeholders. More importantly, because we are now talking about resilience, we would not want to see us in the same situation should there be a new COVID type crisis in the future. We are now informed. We know what it takes. So moving forward, what is going to be critical is the way we move from project level to system level. How do we strengthen education systems using data and evidence generated? I think that's also something that we have actually learned during this time of COVID. It was very interesting in some of our webinars that we organized to see that where evidence is available, key recommendation can trigger government action. So I remember, for example, the Minister of Education of South Africa indicated in one of our this policy level engagement that information provided through the observatory contributed to their decision to reopen school, which is a very important decision for a country. Also, when teachers are affected, learners are affected more. So it is therefore important to consider teacher well-being in any of our intervention moving forward. So let me just stop here, but I think it's very important just to consider those important things as lesson learned. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. We're almost at the close of the session, but I think just in reflecting at everything that you've shared, I mean, for me, really some of the key takeaways of this conversation, I think you've all emphasized partnership, you know, at different levels and in different forms, engaging with teachers as partners. And we, of course, are the Global Partnership for Education. And so the relationships that we have with Education International, in local education groups with the different affiliates that are there, you know, the idea is really that, you know, is that teachers are crucial actors, that their voices have to be reflected in any policy dialogue. And so I think that it's heartening to know that in the COVID context in particular, although the experience was variable, you know, there are good examples of how that happened. I think the idea of partnership also within the education sector, but beyond, the partnership more globally, and I think the global grant in particular was a unique opportunity for us all to work together to support knowledge generation and sharing. You've all emphasized as well the importance of data and evidence. And Albert, I like your point about accountability and really being able to reflect. And I think that's really the spirit of this webinar and the broader evaluation that drove it, is to really take stock and to look back in order to look forward. In speaking of partnership also, I think, I mean, Cristobal, you mentioned parents, and I think we often leave them out of the equation. But this pandemic certainly put those of us who are parents who were struggling with supporting our children's learning very much, I think, front and center as stakeholders. And as you mentioned, I think gave us a new appreciation for what it means to be a teacher. So hopefully that kind of engagement continues. And then Sonia, a couple of the points that you mentioned, I think really resonated with me. As you said, and as your background shows, public services and funding. I think the pandemic has shown us how crucial it is that there's adequate domestic expenditure for education. And this is very much, one of the key rallying cries for the global partnership. But also we know that globally, we are in a very constrained environment in terms of ODA and support for education. So, I think it's really an ongoing conversation, and we have to do everything that we can to ensure that education remains high on the agenda. And then I think lastly, Sonia, as you also mentioned, in many ways, I think we're at an interesting moment in terms of the global dialogue around teachers, and very much due to everything that happened during COVID and the centrality of teachers in being frontline actors. You mentioned the high-level panel, the tests, the recent global report that came out on teachers. So I think there's an interesting momentum now that maybe wasn't present, at the start of the pandemic. And so I think one of the ultimate takeaway for me really is that we have to keep that momentum going and reflect all of this experience and lessons in terms of how we support teachers moving forward. So with that, I think we can close this session. Huge thanks, Sonia, Albert, and Cristobal for being with us and for sharing your insights. And I will turn over to Anna to close us out for the day and tell us what to expect from tomorrow's session. Thank you.
Super. Thank you so much to our superb panelists yet again. I will just share the agenda for tomorrow before we close. All right, so tomorrow we'll be starting at the same time as today, and that's 8 a.m. Washington time, 1 p.m. in Paris. And the session will go from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. And we'll have 2 more thematic sessions. First of them around equity and inclusion, which is going to explore lessons around reaching the most vulnerable children, including girls, children with disabilities, and children in conflict-affected countries, as well as supporting the return to school for all children. And you can see here, we'll have a mix of speakers. We'll have a representative from Rwanda's Ministry of Education, as well as a mix of different partners from UNICEF, Girls Education Challenge, UNESCO, Humanitarian Inclusion, as well as London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Then after that, we will have the session on adaptive implementation, which will consider really that adaptation during the pandemic, given the volatility around school closures and the evolving evidence base. And that session will also continue the reflections on what more we need to do as a sector to be more agile and better placed to support preparedness and response to future disruptions. And so we'll have a representative from Djibouti in that session, as well as some implementing partners sharing different country experiences from the World Bank in Gambia, Save the Children in Somalia, as well as UNICEF and UNESCO IIEP. So we hope you can join us. Thank you so much for being here today, and we hope to see you again tomorrow. Thank you.